The Rings of Power has a big problem, and it's not black elves, black hobbits, or even black dwarves. It's also not a strong female lead, even though it falls into the modern trap of making their female lead act like the most brash and idiotic male protagonist in an attempt to convey strength. But even the utter unlikability of most of its lead cast isn't the biggest problem with Rings of Power. The real issue was present before filming, casting, or writing even began. They simply don't have the rights to do this story justice. Amazon have rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. This includes the appendices of Return of the King, a few hundred pages which include a short paragraph on the First Age, a timeline of the Second Age and Third Ages, and a handful of pages on the Kings of Numenor. It's from these scraps that 5 seasons of the Rings of Power have to be drawn. What these don't include are the majority of the events of the First Age, described in books such as The Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. This problem was perhaps most glaring in Season 1, where these events, which were needed to set the stage for the story, were instead glossed over. We see examples of this in things such as the War of the Elves in Morgoth, the circumstances surrounding Finrod's death, and the betrayal of the humans who sided with Morgoth in the First Age. Instead, we were given a thin shell of these events, which felt much more like generic, lazy fantasy than something with the depth typical of Tolkien's world. The lack of rights isn't a free pass for all the failings of the show in this respect. There were many opportunities within the confines of these limited rights to establish links to the earlier lore, which were totally missed. For example, Celebrimbor's relationship to Feanor, his grandfather, which could have been employed to further develop that character's drive to achieve great feats of craftsmanship worthy of his ancestor. And the writing that filled in the blanks of many of these past events could have also been much better and less hodgepodge. For example, the story of how Mithril was derived from a tree that maybe contained a Silmaril and then got struck by lightning while an elf and a Balrog fought near it is absurdly convoluted, where a simple was lost in the depths of the earth would have both aligned with the lore and given a much more reasonable explanation for why this metal is growing in the depths of Khazad-dûm. The backstory for Elrond and Durin and their petty dispute is also quite dumb. The friendship between the elves of Eregion and the dwarves was a marvel of its time after a bloody history between the races, and a story of Elrond and Durin overcoming racial animosity to become friends could have held much more weight. Similarly, the collapsed timeline was probably unnecessary. The human cast could have been introduced in later seasons without major changes to the story. This could have actually made the first season far less convoluted by avoiding having to send Galadriel and Halbrand on a world tour, first out to sea, then to Numenor, then to the Southlands, then 1,000 kilometers or so to take an apparently mortally wounded Halbrand to the elves in a desperate attempt to connect the plot. So, is the show doomed? I think there's some hope that future seasons can be more coherent and more grounded in Tolkien's works. Looking at the timeline, and knowing that it's already been collapsed into a few decades, I can envisage a plot that goes something like this. And if you don't want spoilers for the possible events of the rest of the Rings of Power, stop watching now. In Season 2, the rest of the rings are forged. Sauron destroys Eregion but is defeated by the Númenóreans and flees. Season 3, Sauron builds strength in the east, while the Númenóreans build in the west. By the end of this season, Sauron is eventually defeated and captured. Season 4 would focus on the fall of Numenor and the building of Gondor and Arnor in its wake. And then the final Season 5 would be centered on the Last Alliance and the events of Sauron's defeat. Outside these canonical events, the show can focus on expanding in areas which Tolkien left unclear, such as the journeys of the stranger in the east. This would build on what have been strengths of the show so far, for example in the character of Adar, or the story of Mordor's creation. Hopefully, with the ability to make their mark in these areas, the writers would be able to let the main storyline breathe a bit, and the show can start to feel a little more like Tolkien and not just Tolkien names pasted onto a generic fantasy.